There is a type of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. You wake already depleted, not from physical exertion. You've rested adequately, maintained your routine, done everything the wellness articles suggest, but the fatigue sits deeper, bone deep, a tiredness that accumulates not in muscle but in the very structure of how you move through the world. You volunteer for the project no one else wants. You mediate the family argument before it escalates. You respond to the text immediately, even when you're drowning. You laugh at the joke that isn't funny. You say yes when every cell in your body whispers no. This isn't occasional accommodation. This is constant calibration. Every interaction becomes a performance requiring real-time assessment. What does this person need from me right now? What version of myself will keep this smooth? The internal script runs automatically, adjusting tone, suppressing reaction, shape-shifting to fit the emotional temperature of the room. You scan faces for micro-expressions of disappointment. You preemptively apologize. You shrink or expand depending on who needs what. Chameleon-like, until you can no longer remember what shape feels native. The confusion arrives slowly. You're doing everything right, being helpful, being considerate, being good, yet you feel increasingly hollow. Energy flows outward constantly toward impression management, conflict prevention, other people's comfort. Nothing flows back. Not because others are taking from you necessarily, but because you've organized your entire existence around a single question: will they like me? And here is where it gets strange. You cannot pinpoint when the performance began. There was no conscious decision to become this. You simply woke one day and realized you don't know where the mask ends and you begin. The boundary has dissolved. What started as adaptive social behavior, necessary navigation of a world that rewards compliance, has calcified into identity itself. The psychiatrist Carl Jung called this the persona, the social face you present to the world, designed to make a specific impression while concealing your true nature. Every person develops a persona. We must. Social life requires it. But Jung warned of a particular danger. Not the mask itself, but fusion with it. When you become indistinguishable from your performance, when you can no longer access what exists beneath the presentation. And he was clear about the cost. A man cannot get rid of himself in favor of an artificial personality without punishment. The punishment arrives as unconscious compensation, bad moods that seem to come from nowhere, obsessive thoughts you cannot quiet, phobias that make no rational sense, and that exhaustion, chronic, unshakable, immune to rest. Your psyche is protesting, not your circumstances, not other people, your own psyche, revolting against the abandonment of self. This video reveals the hidden psychological architecture beneath chronic people-pleasing, the developmental origins that made it feel like survival, the archetypal forces that keep it in place, the shadow material you've disowned to maintain the performance, the measurable physical cost of self-silencing, and the individuation path, not toward selfishness, but toward wholeness, toward a self that can offer genuine compassion because it operates from fullness rather than depletion. This is not behavioral correction. This is psychological death and rebirth. The exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is information. Your body is speaking what you have not yet allowed yourself to say. The exhaustion you feel points toward a specific psychological mechanism, one that operates with such consistency that Jung gave it a name. The persona, not your personality, not your character. The persona is the social face you construct to navigate the world. A mask designed for two simultaneous purposes: to make a definite impression on others and to conceal your true nature. Every psychologically healthy person develops one. You cannot function in social reality without some degree of adaptation, some capacity to modulate expression based on context. The danger is not the mask. The danger is fusion. When you can no longer distinguish between who you are and what you perform, the persona stops being a tool you use and becomes a prison you inhabit. You are no longer wearing the helpful, accommodating self. You are the helpful, accommodating self. The distinction collapses. And with it, access to anything beneath the performance. Jung was unambiguous about the cost. A man cannot get rid of himself in favor of an artificial personality without punishment. The punishment arrives through unconscious compensation. Your psyche will not allow self-abandonment without protest. It responds with what Jung called neurosis, not mental illness, but the psyche's revolt against its own betrayal, the bad moods that seem causeless, the obsessive loops you cannot quiet, the phobias that defy logic, the chronic exhaustion that no amount of rest touches. These are not symptoms of dysfunction. They are symptoms of a psyche demanding acknowledgement. When you over-identify with the persona, enormous energy gets channeled toward maintaining coherence between your performed self and external expectations. You monitor constantly. Is this the right tone? Did that land wrong? Are they disappointed? The internal surveillance system never rests. Organizational psychologists studying emotional labor, the management of feelings to align with role requirements, have documented the measurable consequences: burnout, emotional strain, job dissatisfaction, turnover, and the burden falls disproportionately on women, both professionally and domestically. This is not dramatic. This is data. You become what Jung called the shallow, brittle conformist, the person who is all persona. Life energy flows outward toward impression management, toward what others think, leaving almost nothing for the inward journey toward genuine development. Each interaction requires performance. Each relationship demands careful calibration of expression, opinion, emotional display. You are constantly on stage, and the audience is everyone. The result is a particular kind of poverty. You may be successful by external measures, productive, liked, needed, but internally you are living on fumes. The psyche starves while the persona flourishes, and the gap between what you show and what you are grows wider, requiring more energy to maintain until the system can no longer sustain itself. This is why behavioral strategies fail. Boundary-setting techniques, assertiveness training, time management tools. They address the symptoms while the architecture remains intact. You cannot solve persona fusion with better performance. You cannot resolve self-abandonment by abandoning yourself more efficiently. The exhaustion is not the problem. The exhaustion is your psyche telling you something has been forfeited that cannot be forfeited without cost. What was forfeited did not happen in adulthood. It happened long before you had language to describe it. The persona you cannot shed was not constructed in adulthood. It crystallized before you had words to describe what was happening. You learned, early and wordlessly, that love was conditional. Psychologist Carl Jung identified the mechanism with surgical precision. When caregivers offer regard only under specific conditions, when you're pleasant, when you succeed, when you don't cry, when you meet their emotional needs, you develop what he called conditions of worth. The internalized belief that your value depends on meeting requirements, that belonging has a price, and the price is you. Meta-analytic research across dozens of studies confirms that parental conditional regard correlates with higher anxiety, lower self-esteem, emotional dysregulation, and a self-worth that remains contingent well into adulthood. Approximately 40% of the population develops insecure attachment styles, meaning nearly half of us learned that closeness cannot be trusted without performance. When love becomes transactional, children develop hypervigilance toward caregivers' emotional states. You learn to read faces before words, to detect the shift in your mother's voice that meant danger, to calibrate your behavior based on your father's mood. You became exquisitely attuned not to your own needs, but to the emotional weather of the adults who controlled your survival. Developmental researchers distinguish between two forms of parentification, when children are pressed into adult roles beyond their capacity. Instrumental parentification means household duties, cooking, cleaning, caring for siblings, damaging but less so than the second type. Emotional parentification means meeting your parents' emotional needs, providing comfort, mediation, companionship, becoming their confidant, their therapist, their emotional regulator. This proves more psychologically devastating. The research links emotional parentification consistently with depression and impaired boundary formation that persists across the lifespan. These children learn that relationships require the forfeiture of their own needs as the price of admission. Not sometimes, always. The attachment system, designed by evolution to ensure survival through maintaining closeness with caregivers, becomes organized around approval-seeking rather than authentic connection. This is not conscious strategy. This is neurobiological imprinting, programming that operates beneath awareness. People-pleasing doesn't feel like adaptation. It feels like personality, like who you are. But there is another layer. Trauma researcher Pete Walker expanded the classic stress response framework beyond fight, flight, and freeze to include a fourth: fawn, the strategy of becoming more appealing to the threat. In environments where fighting back invited escalation, where escape was impossible, where freezing brought no protection, children discovered that a modicum of safety could be purchased by becoming useful, by anticipating needs, by managing the emotional states of dangerous adults, by making yourself indispensable. Walker's developmental model traces how each survival response gets extinguished. The child who talks back gets punished until the fight response shuts down. The child who tries to run faces worse consequences until flight becomes unthinkable. What remains is fawning, the supersocial engagement strategy that becomes the template for every relationship that follows. The fawn response serves a co-regulatory function, simultaneously appearing calm, inhibiting your own needs and impulse towards self-protection, and engaging in helpful behavior to regulate others who cannot or will not regulate themselves. This is, as recent research describes it, a gargantuan task, one that exceeds any child's developmental capacity, yet you performed it because survival demanded it. The fawn-adapted adult carries this forward unconsciously, believing that safety in relationships requires preemptive self-abandonment, that to be loved, you must become what others need, that your authentic self, with its anger, its boundaries, its legitimate needs, is fundamentally unlovable. This is not character flaw. This is survival architecture, built in childhood, reinforced through repetition, operating automatically decades later. But survival strategies adaptive in childhood become prisons in adulthood. And these patterns do not exist only in your personal history. They connect to forces larger than individual experience, archetypal patterns that provide unconscious scripts for an entire life. Beyond your personal history, you are living inside scripts written long before you were born. Jung called them archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that exist in the collective unconscious, independent of individual development. They are not metaphors. They are psychic structures with their own momentum, their own intelligence, their own capacity to organize behavior. And when you remain unconscious of them, they possess you. The difference between conscious relationship and archetypal possession is this. When you relate to an archetype consciously, you recognize it as a pattern you can choose to engage or not. When you are possessed by one, you experience it as identity, as who you are. You cannot step outside the script because you don't know you're following one. For people pleasers, 3 archetypes tend to dominate: The caregiver archetype, in its healthy expression, brings genuine compassion and the capacity to nurture. In shadow form, the undeveloped, unconscious version, it manifests as martyrdom, enabling, smothering control, and chronic self-neglect. You become compulsively oriented toward others' needs, not from choice, but from compulsion. The archetype uses you. You caretake because you must, because identity itself depends on being needed. The martyr archetype weaponizes suffering. It uses sacrifice to establish moral superiority, to induce guilt, to control through self-abnegation. The martyr's suffering is simultaneously genuine and strategic, real pain deployed for relational leverage. As Jungian analysts describe it, the shadow martyr trickles bitterness, resentment, and anger that other people are forced to deal with. You give endlessly, then silently catalog every unreturned favor, every unacknowledged effort. The suffering becomes your currency, your proof of virtue, your claim on others' compliance. The hero archetype contributes through compulsive rescuing. You save people not from service, but from ego need. The helping becomes about the helper, your worth validated through others' dependence. This creates a subtle but devastating relational dynamic. You require people who need saving. Their continued weakness serves your identity. You become invested, unconsciously, in their failure to thrive independently. These are not personality traits. These are autonomous forces operating through you. When possessed, you cannot see alternatives. The caregiver cannot not help. The martyr cannot stop sacrificing. The hero cannot let someone struggle without intervening. The behavior feels inevitable, like breathing. You experience yourself as kind, as selfless, as good, never recognizing that these qualities have become compulsions rather than choices. Archetypal possession bypasses conscious will. It provides ready-made scripts for behavior, pre-packaged identities that feel true because they resonate with something ancient and collective. But what feels true is not always what is real. What feels like self is often costume. Integration requires seeing the archetype as separate from identity, recognizing, I am not the caregiver. I am someone who can choose caregiving when appropriate. I am not the martyr. I am someone who can sacrifice meaningfully without weaponizing it. I am not the hero. I am someone who can offer help without requiring dependence. But these archetypal forces do not operate alone. They draw power from what you have disowned, the shadow material you sacrifice to maintain the helpful, selfless persona. And understanding what lives in your shadow requires confronting what you have spent a lifetime refusing to see. The archetypal forces that possess you draw their power from what you have hidden from yourself. Jung called this the shadow, everything your conscious identity excludes. For people pleasers, the shadow contains a specific constellation of qualities: anger, assertiveness, selfishness, the capacity to say no, competitiveness, authentic self-interest, all the qualities that contradict the helpful, accommodating persona you've constructed. But here is what most people misunderstand about shadow. Jung was explicit. It does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. Your shadow is not your darkness. It is your power, disowned, the anger that would have protected you, the selfishness that would have preserved your energy, the competitiveness that would have driven achievement, the capacity to refuse that would have established boundaries. These are not flaws. These are essential psychological resources you sacrifice to maintain acceptance. You made yourself harmless, agreeable, safe, and in doing so, you amputated half your humanity. Nietzsche understood this precisely when he observed, I have often laughed at the weaklings who thought themselves good because they had no claws. Shadow integration means becoming capable of force, without being forceful, potentially dangerous without violence. It means reclaiming the teeth you removed to make others comfortable. The shadow is first encountered through projection. What you cannot acknowledge in yourself, you perceive in others and judge harshly. Notice what triggers you. The colleague who sets clear boundaries, you see them as cold, selfish, uncooperative. The friend who prioritizes their own needs, you experience them as inconsiderate, self-absorbed. The family member who expresses anger directly, you perceive them as aggressive, unreasonable. The emotional intensity is disproportionate to the situation. This is the signature of projection. When someone setting a simple boundary triggers fury or contempt in you, the reaction reveals more about you than about them. They have become a screen onto which you project your own disowned assertiveness. The person you judge is living qualities you have forbidden yourself. And the pattern repeats. Different people, same trigger. Different contexts, same judgment. The specifics change, but the underlying quality remains constant. This is how you locate your shadow, not through introspection, but through noticing what disturbs you in the external world. But projection serves a function. It protects you from confronting what you've disowned. As long as selfishness exists only in others, you don't have to face your own legitimate self-interest. As long as anger lives only in difficult people, you don't have to acknowledge your own rage. The projection allows you to remain identified with the good, helpful self while experiencing the forbidden qualities at a safe distance. There is another layer to this. What appears as empathy in people-pleasers is often fear-based attunement, hypervigilance masquerading as compassion. Organizational researchers studying emotional labor distinguish between genuine emotional responsiveness and the managed production of feelings expected by others. For people-pleasers, this labor extends beyond professional contexts into every relationship. The distinction lies in direction of flow. Healthy empathy means sensing others' emotional states while maintaining clear self-other differentiation. You feel with them, not as them. Fear-based attunement dissolves boundaries. The other person's emotional state floods your system, demanding immediate management to restore equilibrium. This is not connection. This is fusion. Not compassion, but emergency response. Women especially have been socialized to perform emotional labor for safety. Research confirms that correctly inferring others' emotions helps determine danger. When fawning has been a survival adaptation, emotional over-attunement becomes automatic, exhausting, and invisible, mistaken for kindness rather than recognized as hypervigilance. You scan faces, you adjust tone, you manage emotional atmospheres, and you believe this makes you empathic, sensitive, caring. But beneath the performance runs a different mechanism. The terrified child monitoring adults for signs of danger, calibrating behavior to maintain safety. This hyper-attunement is shadow material, not because it's bad, but because it operates unconsciously, driven by fear rather than choice. And it prevents access to healthy boundaries, appropriate self-protection, and the capacity to say, "This is not mine to manage." The shadow contains everything you need to become whole, but accessing it requires facing what you have spent a lifetime avoiding. And that avoidance has consequences that manifest not just psychologically, but physically. The shadow material you refuse to acknowledge psychologically expresses itself somatically. Your body speaks what you will not allow yourself to say. The Framingham Offspring Study followed 3,682 participants for 10 years, tracking a single variable, whether women expressed themselves during spousal conflict or remained silent. The women who self-silenced, who suppressed their authentic responses to maintain relational harmony, had 4 times the mortality risk compared to women who expressed themselves. 4 times. Even after controlling for standard cardiovascular risk factors. This is not metaphor. This is measurable physiological consequence. Chronic self-silencing maintains your stress response system in constant activation. Cortisol remains elevated. Immune function becomes impaired. Systemic inflammation increases. The emotions you suppress, anger, resentment, frustration, grief, do not disappear. They relocate. From psychological channels to somatic ones, the chronic headaches that resist treatment, the gastrointestinal issues with no clear medical cause, the fatigue that no amount of rest touches, the muscle tension that lives permanently in your jaw, your shoulders, your lower back, the cardiovascular strain, the sleep disturbances. These are not random. They are your psyche's alternative language. When psychological conflict exists between what you want and what you allow yourself, emotions with nowhere to go express through the body. Research on irritable bowel syndrome identifies significantly higher emotional suppression in patients, correlating directly with symptom severity. Nearly 50% of patients with medically unexplained physical symptoms show alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. The body becomes the translator for what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. But emotions are not obstacles to clear thinking. They are intelligent signals about unconscious dynamics and boundary violations. When anger arises, something has been crossed. When resentment builds, unmet needs demand attention. When anxiety spikes, something threatens authentic selfhood. These are not problems to manage. They are information to decode. For people pleasers, emotions have typically been managed, suppressed, or dismissed in service of relationship maintenance. You learned early that your feelings were less important than others' comfort, that expressing anger was dangerous, that sadness was burdensome, that needs were selfish. So you developed elaborate systems for emotional regulation, which is to say, emotional suppression. Recovery involves learning to recognize emotional signals and use them as data. The irritation that accompanies a manipulative request contains information about violation. The exhaustion following excessive accommodation reveals depletion. The relief when someone cancels plans signals overcommitment. These feelings are not noise. They are precision instruments detecting what your conscious mind has been trained to ignore. Neuroscience research on interoception, the ability to detect internal bodily signals like heartbeat, respiration, gut feelings, identifies it as central to emotion experience and regulation. When interoceptive awareness is impaired, emotions cannot be processed. They accumulate as somatic tension, as visceral distress, as physical symptoms that demand medical intervention. Research on expressive writing demonstrates that articulating emotions produces measurable health benefits: fewer physician visits, reduced pain, enhanced immune function, decreased anxiety and depression. The mechanism involves cognitive and emotional processing that cannot occur when feelings remain suppressed. The body requires expression. When verbal channels close, somatic channels open. You have been carrying psychological material in your tissues, your organs, your nervous system. The tension in your chest is unexpressed grief. The knot in your stomach is swallowed anger. The chronic pain is accumulated resentment given physical form. Your body is not failing you. Your body is speaking for you. And what it is saying, through exhaustion, through pain, through illness, is that the self you have abandoned demands acknowledgement, that the pattern can no longer be sustained, that something must die for something else to be born. The body's demand for expression points toward an unavoidable transformation, not adjustment, not modification, death. Jung described individuation as tearing off veils. We are like onions with many skins, and we have to peel ourselves again and again in order to get at the real core. For people pleasers, this means the death of the good, helpful identity, the very self-concept that has organized your existence. The alchemical tradition that informed Jung's psychology named this stage nigredo, the blackening. the dark night of the soul. It involves facing the shadow, experiencing the death of previous identity, creating the possibility of the birth of a new self. This is not metaphorical dying. This is phenomenological dying, the experience of dissolution. The helpful, accommodating self has been real. It has structured your relationships, provided meaning, earned belonging, generated purpose. It has been how you know yourself, how others know you, how you navigate the world. Its dissolution feels like losing yourself, because in a fundamental sense, you are. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz observed that individuation generally begins with a wounding of the personality. The ego reaches an impasse of one sort or another. For people-pleasers, this wounding often appears as burnout that won't resolve, chronic illness that resists treatment, relationship collapse despite your best efforts, or depression that refuses to lift, regardless of intervention. The old strategies have stopped working. You have given everything, and it is not enough. You have accommodated endlessly, and the relationships still fracture. You have performed flawlessly, and the emptiness deepens. The persona can no longer be maintained. What felt like self has been revealed as costume. This death unfolds through predictable stages. The pendulum swing arrives first. You swing from boundaryless to rigidly boundaried, from overextending to refusing even minor inconvenience. This feels extreme, even irrational. But the pendulum must swing far in one direction to build self-trust. Once you trust yourself to honor limits, flexibility returns naturally. The rigidity is not the destination. It is the recalibration. The hermit phase follows. After emotional and physical burnout, you withdraw from social life to reconnect with self. Solitude becomes necessary for regrouping. You cancel plans, you ignore texts. You create distance from relationships that have been consuming you. This phase risks becoming permanent isolation if prolonged, but temporary hermitage serves essential recovery. The even more annoyed than before phase surprises many. Your irritation threshold drops dramatically. Things that never bothered you suddenly feel intolerable. This is not regression. This signals newly acknowledged needs. The lower threshold for mistreatment indicates raised standards. You are becoming less tolerant of violation because you are learning what violation is. The "I'm the problem" cascade effect occurs as systems resist disruption. Families, workplaces, friend groups all seek homeostasis. The person who speaks up about dysfunction typically faces scapegoating. Multiple sources may insist you are too sensitive. The real problem, causing unnecessary drama. This is the system's immune response, attempting to expel the foreign element threatening its equilibrium. The "I don't want the life I built" phase emerges as values shift from external markers, harmony, achievement, fitting in, to internal ones. Authenticity, genuine connection, coherence between inner and outer life. The structures built around the old self may no longer fit. The career you chose to please your parents, the relationship you entered to avoid loneliness, the friendships maintained through performance rather than mutual recognition. Psychotherapist Haley McGee describes this as new insides demanding new outsides to match. You look at your life and do not recognize it as yours, because it is not yours. It was built by and for the persona, and the persona is dying. This death is prerequisite to rebirth. The shell must crack for emergence. The form must dissolve for transformation. What you are losing is not your authentic self. What you are losing is the barrier that has prevented access to it. But knowing this intellectually does not make the process less terrifying. The path forward requires developing capacities you have spent a lifetime disowning. The death required creates space for what Jung called the fundamental reorientation of individuation, shifting from ego-directed to self-directed existence. The ego, The I you know is the center of your conscious awareness. It seeks approval, manages impressions, navigates social reality. But Jung distinguished this from the self, capital S, which he described as the total, timeless man, who stands for the mutual integration of conscious and unconscious. The self is not what you think you are. It is what you actually are, the organizing pattern beneath persona and performance. The guiding question transforms from "will they like me?" to "does this align with my inner pattern?" This is not solipsism. This is the recovery of internal authority, the capacity for independent judgment and validation rather than perpetual reliance on external approval. For women especially, this involves what Emma Jung called animus development, cultivating capacity for independent judgment and internal validation, rather than seeking these qualities exclusively through relationship. When this capacity remains undeveloped, you seek conviction and direction through others. Your worth depends on their assessment. Your reality requires their confirmation. Integration means developing what has been projected, making internal what you have sought externally. This does not mean isolation or rejection of relationship. It means the capacity to maintain psychological stability independent of others' responses. Shadow integration requires 3 distinct movements. First, accepting the shadow's existence. The anger, the selfishness, the capacity to refuse, these are not aberrations to eliminate, but essential resources to reclaim. Second, becoming aware of shadow contents through attention to moods, fantasies, and projections. What triggers you reveals what you've disowned. Third, engaging in what Jung called a long process of negotiation, learning to relate to these capacities consciously rather than being overtaken by them. Integration does not mean becoming the shadow or acting out repressed impulses. It means becoming capable of force without being forceful, potentially dangerous without violence. You recover the capacity to refuse, to prioritize self-interest, to feel anger and use it as information, to disappoint others without collapse. These qualities are not negative. They are psychological resources without which you remain defenseless. Daily practice builds capacity. Assertiveness research confirms that 3 to 8 weeks of structured practice produces consistent improvements in communication and reduced anxiety. The Dear Man protocol from dialectical behavior therapy offers a systematic approach. Describe the situation factually. Express your feelings. Assert your needs clearly. Reinforce the benefits of agreement. Remain mindful of your goals. Appear confident. Negotiate as needed. Research found that participants hearing requests delivered this way were nearly 6 times more likely to agree. Self-compassion practice generates measurable shifts: 36% increase in self-kindness, 32% decrease in self-judgment, 34% increase in recognition of common humanity. Psychologist Kristen Neff's research demonstrates that self-compassion produces resilience without the brittleness of self-esteem, stable internal support independent of performance or approval. Values. Clarification anchors authentic action when external validation is removed. Acceptance and commitment. Therapy research demonstrates that connecting behavior to values improves psychological flexibility and reduces symptoms across diverse populations. The daily practices, journaling about actual preferences rather than acceptable ones, practicing small no's before attempting major boundaries, expressing opinions in low-stakes contexts, regularly asking, "What do I actually want?" Relational disruption becomes inevitable. Family systems theorist Murray Bowen observed that systems seek homeostasis and resist change through predictable change-back responses. Minimizing your concerns, labeling you as the problem, mobilizing others against you. Preparation for this resistance proves essential. The person who sets boundaries after years of accommodation will encounter pushback. Bowen noted that if the differentiating one can stay on course without defending self or counterattacking, the emotional reaction is usually brief, and the other then expresses appreciation. The practice involves maintaining position without retaliation, allowing others' anxiety without being destabilized by it. Some relationships cannot survive authenticity. Connections built on unspoken contracts of self-sacrifice collapse when the contract changes. This loss is genuine and mournable, even when ultimately clarifying. Other relationships transform, the initial resistance giving way to deeper connection once the system adjusts. Discerning which relationships can evolve requires patience, experimentation, and tolerance for uncertainty. What emerges on the other side is not isolation, but a fundamentally different quality of connection. The relational disruption you navigate reveals something unexpected. Authenticity does not repel connection, it attracts it. Research on perceived partner authenticity demonstrates associations with more adaptive relationship goals, greater trust, higher satisfaction, and stronger commitment. Partners perceived as authentic are seen as more trustworthy, precisely because authenticity signals aversion to deception and openness to intimacy. Columbia University researchers found that in initial interactions, people are attuned to partner authenticity as a precondition for establishing shared reality. When someone seems authentic, relationship initiation increases. The fear that drove the performance, that your real self would be rejected, proves empirically unfounded. The shift moves from utility-based to soul-based connection. Relationships no longer serve as stages for approval-seeking or vehicles for validation. Connection becomes about mutual recognition rather than exchange, presence rather than performance. You stop relating to others as sources of worth and begin relating to them as separate beings worthy of genuine encounter. Meta-analysis of 75 studies involving over 36,000 participants found a moderate to strong correlation between authenticity and well-being, a relationship that held across age, gender, and sample type. Authenticity does not simply accompany well-being. Research suggests it may constitute its core. When people feel authentic, distressing circumstances prove more tolerable. Perceived authenticity attenuates the negative impact of loneliness on depression, anxiety, and physical symptoms. Psychologists studying the true self as guide theory propose that people use feelings of authenticity as cues for evaluating whether they are living meaningful lives. But living authentically requires accepting that you will disappoint some people and recognizing this disappointment as evidence of integrity rather than failure. The person who pleases everyone has subordinated truth to harmony. The person who maintains authentic position despite others' discomfort has achieved what family systems theory calls differentiation, a clear sense of self while remaining emotionally connected. Not isolation, not independence. Differentiation, the capacity to be yourself in the presence of others without requiring their agreement. The practice involves choosing discomfort over resentment. The discomfort of saying no is acute but brief. The resentment of unwanted yes accumulates, corrodes, eventually destroys the relationship it was meant to preserve. Building tolerance for others' disappointment means recognizing that disapproval stings without needing to stop authentic action. Self-compassion research demonstrates that self-compassionate individuals show greater emotional resilience with less ego defensiveness than those relying on external validation. They cope better during challenges. They maintain stability independent of others' responses. They weather disapproval without collapse. What emerges is not selfishness, but wholeness. A self capable of genuine compassion because it operates from fullness rather than depletion. capable of authentic connection because it no longer requires fusion for safety, capable of setting limits because it has integrated the capacity to refuse. The people pleaser who individuates does not stop caring about others. They stop disappearing into that care. Jung wrote that the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. This self was always present, obscured by persona, projected onto others, silenced by conditional love. The individuation journey is not creating something new, but uncovering what was buried, the authentic pattern that has waited beneath the mask. This transformation is not behavioral modification, but psychological death and rebirth. The path from people-pleasing to authenticity requires confronting the conditional love that formed the adaptation, integrating the shadow qualities sacrificed to maintain acceptance, developing inner authority independent of external validation, and allowing the death of the pleasing ego that has organized existence. The exhaustion you felt was information, your body, speaking what you had not yet allowed yourself to say. You are learning to listen. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here and leave a comment with your reflections. Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.